September, in the year 2015, did not bring the usual warmth of a late summer to County Tipperary, Ireland. Instead, it brought a heavy grey mist that seemed to cling to the stone walls of the village churchyard. And there, standing in the middle of a rain-slicked crowd, was a man the entire world thought they knew. He was dressed in black, his face lined with an expression that no Hollywood director could ever script. As he lifted the weight of a wooden coffin onto his shoulder, the cameras caught a glimpse of something raw, broken, and terrifyingly real. This was a billionaire icon of global joy, a man who had spent 3 decades functioning as the world's ultimate escape valve, carrying the final remains of a woman he had loved, whose sudden and tragic passing had just shattered his world. For 30 years, an entire generation had consumed his energy like a drug. He was the man with the rubber face, the hyper-energetic force of nature, who could contort his body and his voice to banish anyone's depression for a couple of hours. He had built an untouchable, multi-million-dollar armor of pure, unadulterated manic bliss. But within months of that rainy day in Ireland, that armor did not just crack. It was systematically torn apart in the most public way imaginable. The grief quickly mutated into an ugly, ruthless legal war. Explosive civil lawsuits emerged from the shadows, pointing fingers directly at the icon. Accusations flooded the public space, claiming he had used a secret alias to procure the very prescription substances that ended her life, alleging manipulation and threatening to expose the most intimate, painful medical secrets he had desperately tried to keep private. In a matter of weeks, the man who had made the entire planet laugh was being painted by corporate attorneys as a destructive, hollow force. The public persona was completely undone. It left the world staring at a profound, unsettling paradox. How does the brightest light end up surrounded by the deepest darkness? Was the manic joy we all laughed at for decades actually a genuine expression of happiness? Or was it a desperate, lifelong negotiation with an internal shadow? To understand how the world's most joyful man became a symbol of profound, existential isolation, and why he would eventually walk away from the fame entirely, we cannot look at the peak of his success. Before we can answer any of that, we must go back to the beginning. To understand the mask, you have to understand the room where it was forged. It did not begin in the sun-drenched, palm-lined streets of Southern California, but in the biting, unforgiving winters of Ontario, Canada. This was not the Canada of postcard landscapes, but a world of gray, industrial monotony, specifically the towns of Newmarket and Burlington. It was an environment defined by a constant, low-frequency hum of financial dread, where tomorrow was never guaranteed and security was a luxury the family simply could not afford. At the center of this world was a young boy watching his mother. Kathleen was a woman perpetually trapped in the grip of severe, chronic illnesses and profound emotional distress. She was often bedridden, her body aching, her mind consumed by a quiet desperation that filled the small house with a suffocating gravity. For a child, a parent's pain is a terrifying, existential threat. It is a universe spinning out of control. And it was in that exact room, at the foot of his mother's sickbed, that the psychological armor of Jim Carrey was born. He was only 8 years old when he realized that if he did something absurd, if he threw his body against a wall, if he contorted his face into impossible shapes, if he imitated the sound of a dying bird, the heavy silence in the room would break. His mother would smile. For a few fleeting moments, the illness would lose its grip. It was a profound, heavy realization for a child. Humor was not a choice, and it certainly was not a hobby. It was a transactional survival mechanism. It was a desperate, intuitive attempt to heal his mother and keep her tethered to this world through the sheer exhausting force of his own performance. He became addicted to the high of changing someone else's internal weather because his own internal weather was so profoundly terrifying. But the universe was about to test the limits of that survival mechanism. The true crushing blow landed when his father, Percy, a gentle, saxophone-playing accountant who represented the family's sole anchor of stability, lost his job. The dominoes fell with a brutal mathematical certainty. The family lost their home. They were forced to pack whatever pieces of their lives would fit into a Volkswagen camper van, living on the margins, parked on the sides of roads, tasting the raw bitterness of sudden poverty. Eventually, they found a grim lifeline. A local tire factory offered them a place to stay in exchange for grueling, collective manual labor. The entire family became janitors and security guards. By the age of 16, Jim had dropped out of high school, trading his education for 8-hour shifts of scrubbing floors, cleaning toilets, and carrying an overwhelming, exhausting rage. He would later admit that during those years in the factory, he wanted to smash things. He looked at the world with a burning resentment because the world had taken his father's dignity and his mother's health, leaving him trapped in a cycle of filth and poverty. It was out of this specific, volatile mixture of childhood terror and adolescent rage that the legendary persona was cast. He constructed an impenetrable, hyper-animated identity designed to ensure that he could never be ignored, never be starved, and never be abandoned again. If he could become loud enough, fast enough, and brilliant enough, the world would have no choice but to look at him. He would project an illusion of total control, a display of comedic dominance so intense that no one would ever see the traumatized boy cleaning toilets in an Ontario tire factory. But this armor, built to protect him from the harsh realities of his youth, carried a hidden psychological debt. And as he prepared to risk everything on the comedy stages of Los Angeles, that debt was about to come due. He packed up his anger, his desperation, and the few clothes he owned, and made the dangerous pilgrimage to the neon-lit concrete of Los Angeles. It was the early 1980s, an era when the comedy scene at places like the Comedy Store on Sunset Boulevard was less of a creative community and more of a psychological gladiatorial arena. He was entering a world where hundreds of hungry minds arrived every week, all trying to escape their own pasts, all competing for a few minutes of stage time that might lead to a late-night television spot. For a young man from Canada with no safety net, this was the ultimate gamble. He had rejected the conventional path of steady labor, refusing to let the gray walls of a factory dictate the rest of his life. But the city did not welcome him with open arms. Instead, the early years in Hollywood offered a masterclass in absolute humility and isolation. He lived on the raw, frayed fringes of the entertainment industry, sleeping on stained couches in cramped apartments, counting pennies for basic meals, and existing in a state of hyper-vigilant anxiety. The first taste of what seemed like a breakthrough came when he landed a leading role on a network television sitcom called The Duck Factory in 1984. For a fleeting moment, it felt like the psychological debt was paid. He was earning a real salary. He was able to bring his struggling parents out to California, and it seemed as though the armor had done its job. He had conquered the system. But Hollywood has a cruel way of giving a glimpse of the summit just before pulling the ground out from under your feet. The show was a critical and commercial failure, abruptly canceled after only a handful of episodes. The sudden collapse plunged him right back into a severe financial panic. But this time, the fall was far more devastating because he had tasted the alternative. The money evaporated. The industry's attention shifted to the next bright young thing, and he was left standing in a city that felt entirely indifferent to his survival. He was forced to send his parents back to Canada, a moment that cut deeply into his sense of worth. reinforcing the terrifying childhood belief that he was failing to protect the people he loved. This was the era of the great psychological precipice. Broke, emotionally exhausted, and watching his family struggle from thousands of miles away, he found himself staring down total failure before his career had truly even begun. It was during these dark, stagnant nights that he would drive his battered car up the winding roads of the Hollywood Hills, parking on the crest of Mulberry Drive. He would look down at the millions of twinkling lights of Los Angeles, a city that felt like a massive, uncaring machine. And he would engage in an act of pure, desperate psychological warfare against his own despair. It was here that he famously wrote himself a post-dated check for $10 million for services rendered, giving himself a deadline of 10 years. It wasn't an act of arrogant confidence. It was a psychological shield. It was a visual anchor constructed to keep him from driving off the edge of the cliff, a desperate attempt to force the universe to recognize the manic energy he was radiating. He was living on the absolute edge of creative extinction, realizing that the old tricks weren't working anymore. He had to completely dismantle his standard impressionist routine, the safe, crowd-pleasing mimicry, and find something far more dangerous, visceral, and undeniable if he ever wanted to survive the valley. The answer to that survival came in a historic, unprecedented explosion of cultural dominance that the entertainment industry had never seen before and will likely never witness again. The year was 1994. In a span of just 12 months, 3 separate films were released that did not just succeed, they completely cannibalized the global box office. First came the absurd, hyper-stylized chaos of Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, a project that every major star had turned down and that the industry expected to bomb. Instead, his manic, boundary-pushing performance turned it into a cultural phenomenon. Months later, The Mask arrived, a film that perfectly weaponized his physical elasticity, turning his actual face into a living, breathing cartoon. By the time Dumb and Dumber closed out the year, the hierarchy of Hollywood had been completely upended. He had accomplished the impossible, moving from a broke stand-up comic on the verge of obscurity to a load-bearing pillar of a multi-billion-dollar industry. He became the first actor in cinematic history to command a staggering, record-breaking $20 million salary per film. To understand the mechanics of this charm is to understand how a global audience falls in love. He did not just act, he possessed a room. When he walked onto a talk show set or a movie screen, his energy was so overwhelming, so aggressively joyous, that it felt completely intoxicating to a world looking for an escape. He was a human lightning rod, bending his joints, distorting his jaw, and throwing his entire physical being into every syllable. The world could not look away because his performance style felt like the ultimate liberation from the mundane, polite rules of society. He was surrounded by an army of handlers, an entourage of admirers, and unchecked, monumental wealth. He was standing on the absolute summit of human fame, his face plastered on billboards from Tokyo to New York, his name a golden guarantee of success. The boy who had cleaned toilets in Ontario was now wealthy enough to buy the factory. He had achieved everything the psychological armor had been built to secure. The world was watching, the world was applauding, and the world loved him. But as he stood at the absolute peak of global adoration, the deafening sound of the applause was hiding a massive, internal debt that was quietly preparing to come due. But the applause, however deafening, could not silence the quiet, persistent frequency humming beneath the surface of his own mind. Achieving the summit of global adoration had not banished the shadow of his youth. It had only amplified it. The $20 million paychecks and the magazine covers provided a comfortable distance from the tire factory, but they did not provide peace. It was this creeping realization that external validation was a bottomless pit that could never be filled, that drove him to stop merely performing for escape and start using his art as a form of painful, emotional excavation. In the late 90s, the comic icon transformed his work into a therapeutic masterclass, using the screen to bleed out the very isolation that fame was supposed to cure. The first profound pivot came with The Truman Show in 1998. On the surface, it was a satirical commentary on the rise of reality television. But in Jim's hands, it was a deeply disturbing mirror of his own reality. He played Truman Burbank, a man whose entire life, unbeknownst to him, is a carefully orchestrated simulation, surrounded by actors pretending to be his family and friends, all watched by a global audience of billions inside a massive, climate-controlled dome. This was not a character he had to search for. It was the ultimate metaphor for his own existence. He was the world's highest-paid commodity, trapped inside the transparent bubble of celebrity, forced to be on at all times, with no concept of where the performance ended and his own life began. The profound vulnerability he showed as Truman realized the artificiality of his world was not acting. It was a visible manifestation of his own existential claustrophobia. He was screaming for an escape door that didn't exist. This excavation process reached its terrifying, absolute extreme in Man on the Moon in 1999. He did not play the legendary avant-garde comic Andy Kaufman. He was literally consumed by him. In an act of total psychological erasure, Jim refused to break character off camera, bringing the disruptive, chaotic energy of Kaufman and his aggressive, abusive alter ego, Tony Clifton, onto the set, tormenting the director, the cast, and the crew. He was erasing the burden of being Jim Carrey by fully inhabiting the ghost of another man, using Kaufman's life as a proxy to explore his own rage against the expectations of show business. He was demonstrating that his identity was fluid, artificial, and terrifyingly fragile, pushing his own mental stability to the breaking point just to feel something raw and honest again. This artistic deconstruction culminated in 2004 with Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Stripping away the manic energy, the funny faces, and the transactional charm, he reached into the profound, hollowed-out spaces left by his failed marriages and turbulent relationships to play the introverted Joel Barish. It was a performance of raw, quiet, heartbreaking desperation, a man physically, painfully fighting his own mind to hold on to the memories of a lost love, even as those memories are being erased by a medical procedure. He wasn't relying on physical elasticity here. He was relying on the elasticity of grief. He was projecting the ultimate human agony, the paradoxical desire to forget the pain of loss, while simultaneously understanding that the pain is the only thing that proves the love was ever real. This trilogy of performances wasn't just cinema. They were a cry for help that the world mistook for brilliance. The paradox of this artistic excavation was that while he was pouring his internal chaos into his work, his actual world, the massive, lucrative empire he had built, was quietly but systematically beginning to unravel. By the mid-2000s, the invisible cracks in his foundation were becoming impossible to ignore. This was not a spectacular, explosive crash. It was a slow, quiet, polite fracturing of his reality, shielded by the same polished PR machine that marketed his comedies. Contrast the peak of his global power, the moment he seemed to possess the master key to the universe, with the reality of his personal life. His first marriage to a waitress he met in his struggling comedy store days ended as his fame began its rapid ascent. A second marriage to a co-star from one of his breakout hits lasted less than a year, collapsing under the immense crushing weight of public scrutiny and private isolation. There were brief, tumultuous romances that seemed designed more for entertainment headlines than genuine connection. Behind the scenes, he earned a reputation not for being joyful, but for being intensely brooding, deeply melancholic, and often completely unreachable, receding into a profound stillness that terrified him. This private fracture was exacerbated by his fatal flaw, a lifetime addiction to external validation, born on that sickbed in Canada, coupled with a paralyzing terror of stillness. The manic energy that had made him rich was a defense mechanism. When the cameras stopped, the stillness forced him to confront the exact ghosts he had been outrunning since he was 8 years old. When the noise faded, the silence in the room became deafening. This growing internal darkness began to leak into the public square in increasingly alarming ways in the late 2000s and early 2010s. The once dependable leading roles began to dry up, or he rejected them, a retreat that fueled growing industry speculation. Bizarre red carpet interviews surfaced, where he would stare intently into a microphone and declare that there is no meaning, that there is no Jim, that we are all just avatars in an infinite simulation. The world laughed nervously, assuming this was just another layer of his abstract performance art, but these were the first public symptoms of a psychological shield that had finally shattered. He was detaching from the reality that adored him because that adoration no longer sustained him. And a storm was quietly gathering that was about to turn this internal detachment into a total public catastrophe. The storm that had been gathering in the quiet corners of his life finally made landfall in September of 2015, and the destruction it left behind would permanently alter the trajectory of his existence. The sudden, tragic passing of Catriona White in her Los Angeles home did not just break his heart. It ignited a ruthless, multi-year public autopsy of his entire private life. The narrative anchor of his public persona, the benevolent, grieving protector holding a coffin in a rain-slicked Irish churchyard, was systematically dismantled by an aggressive legal onslaught that played out across global tabloids. The civil wrongful death lawsuits filed by Mark Burton and Bridget Sweetman pulled back the curtain on a hidden world of immense psychological pain. Private text messages were subpoenaed, leaked, and analyzed by millions. The legal documents painted an incredibly dark portrait of the icon, alleging that he had utilized a hidden alias, Arthur King, to illegally procure the highly regulated prescription medications that were found at the scene. Further accusations emerged, claiming he had manipulated vulnerable dynamics and transmitted painful medical burdens while actively hiding them from the world. For a man who had built his entire life on the transactional need to be loved, to heal, and to bring joy, being publicly accused of causing profound harm was the ultimate, devastating irony. It was a complete shattering of the rubber mask. Though his legal team fought back fiercely, launching an extensive countersuit that eventually proved the allegations relied on forged medical documents and amounted to a multi-million-dollar extortion plot, leading to the absolute dismissal of all claims in January of 2018, the victory offered no comfort. The legal clearance could not undo the psychological damage. The industry he had carried on his back for decades grew quiet. The phone stopped ringing with the same frequency. The public adoration was replaced by an uncomfortable, distant curiosity, and an absolute, paralyzing isolation set in. The world had seen behind the curtain, and Hollywood, which values a pristine commodity above all else, quietly pulled back. But it was within this absolute exile that the final, most profound transformation occurred. He did not spend his isolation begging for his old life back. Instead, he stepped completely through the exit door he had been looking for since The Truman Show. He retreated into a sprawling, quiet art studio, trading the glare of movie cameras for the raw, visceral release of abstract painting and sculpture. He began pouring gallons of vibrant, chaotic paint onto massive canvases, using his hands to physically strike the surfaces, bleeding his remaining sanity out onto the canvas. When he did occasionally re-emerge into the public eye, he spoke with the flat, calm cadence of a man who had looked into the abyss and found peace in the emptiness. He began publicly declaring that Jim Carrey had never actually existed. He explained that the energetic icon the world had fallen in love with was merely an avatar, a highly sophisticated, beautifully constructed piece of psychological armor built by a terrified 8-year-old boy in Canada who just wanted to keep his mother alive and escape the crushing weight of poverty. Ultimately, his story stands as a brilliant, devastating tragedy about the high cost of human defense mechanisms. The rubber mask didn't just protect a lonely child from the harsh realities of the world. It protected the world from seeing the beautiful, incredibly complex, and fragile human being underneath. He had spent his entire life trying to heal the world's pain to forget his own, only to realize that true liberation could only begin when the applause finally stopped, the armor completely broke, and he was left entirely alone in the quiet.